Something small happens just before Lewis Hamilton reaches a corner. It's easy to miss unless you watch closely, and even experienced Formula One fans often don't notice it during live broadcasts. The car approaches the braking zone at full speed, everything looks normal, and then just before the braking point, something subtle changes. The engine note drops slightly, the car settles for a moment, and only after that does the braking begin. It's a tiny detail, almost invisible in real time, but telemetry comparisons have shown that Lewis Hamilton often does one small thing before corners that many other drivers do differently. He slightly lifts off the throttle earlier than expected. Not dramatically, not enough to stand out, but just enough to change how the car behaves before braking. That tiny adjustment might be one of the reasons Lewis Hamilton is known as one of the smoothest and most consistent drivers in Formula One history. Because that small moment before braking changes more than most people realize. In Formula One, the approach to a corner usually follows a predictable pattern. Drivers accelerate at full throttle along the straight until they reach their braking marker. Once they hit that marker, they apply heavy brake pressure to reduce speed as quickly as possible. The transition from full throttle to maximum braking often happens very quickly. Drivers aim to minimize the time spent between accelerating and braking because every moment without acceleration can cost lap time. The goal is simple: carry maximum speed for as long as possible before slowing down for the corner. Engineers often analyze throttle and brake traces to find the exact moment drivers switch from acceleration to deceleration. Ideally, that transition happens at precisely the right location on the track. Too early and time is lost, too late and the car may overshoot the corner. Most drivers therefore try to stay at full throttle right up to the braking point before making a decisive transition onto the brakes. When you look at telemetry from many drivers, this pattern becomes clear. The throttle trace stays near 100% until the braking phase begins. Then the brake pressure rises sharply as speed drops. The transition looks sudden and efficient. This approach works well because it maximizes straight-line speed and minimizes unnecessary coasting. It is a method built around precision and timing, and at first glance it appears to be the fastest way to approach a corner. That is why Lewis Hamilton's telemetry sometimes stands out. Instead of staying completely flat on the throttle until the braking point, Lewis often lifts slightly earlier. The throttle trace drops before the braking phase begins, creating a short period where the car is neither fully accelerating nor fully braking. The difference is small, sometimes only a fraction of a second, but it appears repeatedly in data comparisons. At first, this difference looked unimportant. A tiny lift before braking should theoretically cost time because the car is no longer accelerating at full speed. Some engineers initially assumed the early lift might simply be a margin of safety or a response to changing grip conditions. Drivers sometimes adjust their braking approach depending on tire temperature or track conditions. It seemed reasonable to assume that Lewis might simply be managing risk in difficult conditions. But the pattern appeared even during qualifying laps when drivers push as hard as possible. That suggested something more deliberate was happening. Another explanation focused on car setup. Some believe the Mercedes cars Lewis drove during his championship years might have required a slightly different approach to braking. Suspension characteristics, aerodynamic balance, and brake behavior can influence how drivers approach corners. A car that is sensitive under braking might encourage a driver to prepare the car before applying full brake pressure, but this theory also had limitations. Lewis Hamilton showed similar behavior across multiple seasons and different car designs. Even when the cars changed significantly, the early lift pattern remained visible in telemetry comparisons. Engineers then began looking more closely at what happened during that small moment before braking. The early lift off the throttle allowed the car to begin slowing slightly through aerodynamic drag and engine resistance. Although the deceleration was small compared to braking forces, it started the process of reducing speed in a more gradual way. Instead of switching instantly from acceleration to heavy braking, Lewis often created a smoother transition between the two phases. That smoother transition turned out to have important effects on the car's balance. When a driver suddenly applies heavy brake pressure at high speed, the car experiences rapid weight transfer toward the front tires. The front suspension compresses and the rear becomes lighter. If this weight transfer happens too abruptly, the rear tires can lose stability. The car may feel nervous or unsettled just before turn-in. Drivers must then make small corrections to keep the car balanced. Lewis Hamilton's early throttle lift reduced the severity of that initial weight transfer. Because the car had already begun slowing slightly, the braking phase started from a more controlled state. The suspension settled more gradually and the rear tires remained more stable. This stability allowed Lewis to approach the braking limit with greater confidence. Instead of reacting to sudden changes in balance, he could apply brake pressure smoothly and predictably. The car felt calmer during the most critical phase of corner entry. Onboard footage often reflects this difference. The car appears composed as it approaches the corner, with fewer visible corrections compared to drivers who rely on a sudden braking transition. The calm behavior is not accidental. It is the result of preparing the car before braking begins. The early lift also influences how the tires behave. Tires generate grip most effectively when loads change smoothly rather than abruptly. Sudden changes in load can push the tires beyond their optimal range, reducing available grip. By easing into the deceleration phase, Lewis allowed the tires to adapt more gradually to the changing forces. This helped maintain consistent grip during the transition from straight-line braking to corner entry. Engineers studying tire data sometimes noticed that Lewis maintained stable grip levels during braking zones where other drivers experienced small fluctuations. Another effect appeared during the transition into trail braking. Trail braking requires careful control of brake pressure as the driver begins turning the steering wheel. Too much brake pressure while turning can overload the front tires and cause instability. Too little pressure reduces rotation and makes the car reluctant to turn. The smoother deceleration created by the early lift allowed Lewis to reach the trail braking phase in a more balanced state. This made it easier to control the car's rotation into the corner. The advantage became particularly clear in medium-speed corners where braking and turning overlap significantly. In these corners, stability during the transition phase is critical. Drivers who arrive at turn-in with an unsettled car often need extra steering corrections to maintain the racing line. Those corrections can scrub speed and reduce efficiency. Lewis Hamilton's smoother approach often reduced the need for these adjustments. The steering trace frequently showed smaller corrections as the car entered the corner. Although the early lift appears to sacrifice a small amount of speed before braking, the time gained later in the corner can compensate for that loss. A stable car allows earlier rotation, which in turn allows earlier throttle application on exit. Earlier acceleration increases speed along the following straight, often producing a net gain over the entire corner sequence. Engineers analyzing lap times often found that Lewis maintained competitive or superior corner exit speeds despite the slight reduction in approach speed. This balance between entry speed and exit speed is one of the key elements of Formula One driving technique. A driver who focuses only on maximum entry speed may struggle to accelerate efficiently on exit. A driver who prepares the car carefully before the corner can often achieve a better overall result. Lewis Hamilton's early throttle lift represents a subtle example of this principle in action. The small adjustment before braking influences everything that follows in the corner. Telemetry traces reveal this pattern in subtle ways. The throttle line drops slightly before the braking phase. Speed reduction begins gradually rather than abruptly. Brake pressure builds smoothly, steering corrections remain minimal. Acceleration begins earlier on exit. None of these differences are dramatic on their own, but together they form a consistent picture of a carefully controlled corner entry. This small technique also reflects a broader characteristic of Lewis Hamilton's driving style. He is often described as smooth, but that smoothness comes from deliberate control rather than passive driving. Each input is timed to maintain balance and efficiency. The early throttle lift is not about driving cautiously, it is about preparing the car to operate at its best during the most demanding phases of the corner. And this is where the full explanation becomes clear. The one small thing Lewis Hamilton does before every corner is lifting slightly off the throttle earlier than most drivers. That tiny moment allows the car to settle before braking begins. The smoother transition improves stability, preserves tire grip, and reduces unnecessary corrections. Those advantages combine to produce cleaner corner entries and more efficient exits. Once you understand this detail, onboard footage begins to look different. The moment before braking becomes easier to recognize. The engine note drops slightly earlier. The car appears calm as it approaches the corner. What once looked like ordinary driving begins to reveal a deeper level of precision. Because sometimes in Formula One, the biggest advantages come from the smallest adjustments. And one of the reasons Lewis Hamilton remains one of the fastest drivers in the sport may be a tiny throttle lift that most people never notice at all.